Hello, welcome to the Margin of Curiosity, the podcast where ideas compound like capital. I'm Ronnie, and every week I explore business, money, mindset lessons hidden in plain sight. Today, I want to talk about the whole business behind companies making pledges to invest in the United States or invest in the government, mostly in the United States. Let's roll the tape. So one of the things that has always been of interest to me has always been the whole idea of governments pledging like certain amount of money or huge amounts of money to invest in the government. Like especially during the Trump's administration, the second administration, we hear a lot of those. You see um, Meta or Facebook, if you will, is say they will invest $600 billion, up to $600 billion, and Apple, I think Apple says something around $350 billion or $500 billion or something like that. And you have other companies also like Toyota say they're going to invest all these billions of dollars, and all these companies throw money around. Google said something around 500 billion as well over a certain period of time. Now, that sounds very fine. It sounds fancy. It sounds very encouraging. But I've always wondered, what does that actually mean? Because it's easy to say those things. The average person like me and a bunch of other people may not necessarily understand or see the results of those investments, because all we hear about is say, okay, well, the administration is doing well, all this money coming through. But what does that actually mean to the average person? Now, I did a little digging on it, and I'm going to riff on this a little bit. So just bear with me because I did some research and I came up with a few things. Now, when we talk about pledge, right? What do we understand by pledge, right? One thing that I found out is when a company says they're pledging a certain amount of money, this is not like, at least this is what I used to think. I used to think that maybe the company would just do some major investments, right? They will maybe, no, take example like Apple says, oh, we're going to invest $350 billion, and a bunch of people could assume, because I hear people talk about this, that the money they're gonna move manufacturing to the US, or they're gonna start assembling their iPhones now in the US. Nah, that is not true. That is not what the pledge means, right? That is absolutely not true. Now, Toyota, on the other hand, what I can say about Toyota is Toyota, since they have a manufacturing plant, I think in somewhere in South Carolina here, because I'm in North Carolina, so basically Charlotte. So it's probably somewhere around here, if I'm not mistaken. Now, Toyota's a little different because they have a plant here. It's easier to say, okay, they're going to put more money into the plant. But we can also argue that Toyota pledged all this money because they want to avoid the tariffs that Trump put in place. But when we talk about pledge, what do we understand about the word pledge? So when a company says, I'm pledging, let's say, $600 billion like Meta did up to 4 years, what they're essentially saying is we are going to, this is the amount of money that we're going to eventually spend, right, in the US or in any things or operations that are tied to the US. It is not necessarily a manufacturing plant. It is not necessarily, building a new facility. It means so many different things. It means so many different things. It's not just a company say, well, $600 billion, we're just going to put the money somewhere and let the money or just create jobs randomly. That's a good move. That's a good PR strategy. But let's try to look into it a little bit, right? So when you talk about the pledge, right, like I mentioned, it's all about, okay, we're going to put this amount of money. But keep in mind that the things change. Sometimes the companies don't even invest that money. Now, three things typically happen when you hear a company do a pledge. There's always strategy, it is signal to the government, and there's marketing, right? So the strategy part is more from the company side. So the company is basically telling investors, hey, look, this is where we're going to focus. This is where we're going to put our money. So if a company like, let's say, Apple, for example, says we're going to invest up to $600 billion in 5 years or $500 billion in 5 years. Now the investors know, okay, we're going to spend up to $500 billion. Now, if you split that up for like 5 years, that's $100 billion a year. This is where we're going to put the money in different, like, but they don't say that specifically. We're just going to invest. Now, what does investment mean? That is something we're going to look into somewhere down the line. Now, there's also signals to the government, right? A lot of times these investments are just political goodwill. If you notice, and as far as my short time, I can say short in America, because I've been through what, maybe 6 elections. And this is probably the only time that I remember that people are coming public, companies are coming public to say, oh, I'm investing this, I'm investing that. Because I remember watching this kind of a meeting that Trump had with tech executives, where he was asking Google how much you say you're going to invest, Facebook how much you say you're going to invest, all that. That is just political signaling, because they have tariffs in place. He's coming after these guys for, okay, we need to bring the money back, the jobs back to America. We need to do this, we need to do that. So all that stuff is all political goodwill. So you know, uh, uh, the country can feel good about it again, which is fine in a sense, but at the same time, it is not entirely honest, because that is sometimes it's just blowing up smoke of people just to make people feel good, and also just to put the person in power and good standing, or make them feel good about their voters, or whatever the case might be. And the third part is also the marketing part, right? That is the marketing part is more about public perception, because if you think about it, when a company like Apple or Google announces that, maybe it might get their stock price up a little bit, maybe in a positive direction, and it might also, in terms of you know of how people perceive them, the perception that people are going to have about them is going to be more, okay, it's favorable, okay, they care about the country, they're trying to bring more jobs, so people start feeling good about it. But now the big question is, do we actually see the jobs? Because a lot of times you hear those pledges and nothing really changes. Now, what are the couple of different forms of investment that you might encounter when it comes to the pledges, right? Because they talk about, oh, invest this amount of money. Now, what are some of investments? Now, one of the investments is capex, or capital expenditure. So in this case, when we talk about capital expenditure, it could be a bunch of things. It could be things like buildings. It could be manufacturing facilities. It could be data centers, right? So that is part of capital expenditure. Now, the good part about capital expenditure is you can see it, right? So if, let's say, Amazon is building a new warehouse, right? You can walk down the street and see it. You can see the warehouse there. Okay, this is operational. So anybody can drive by and see it. That is a good part about it. And that one, of course, it creates jobs that you can see, right? So that is a good part about the capital expenditure. Now, another form of investment is R&D. Now, R&D, on the other hand, is a little different, because that requires, of course, R&D means research and development. So there's research and development that you can't always see per se, because it is not something physical, right? Of course, it requires hiring. Maybe you hire engineers, hire scientists, you hire a bunch of different people that, again, those are like highly skilled jobs that, it is, of course, the openings are not going to be on Indeed or like the local newspaper, because not everybody is highly skilled at that level. So that's another form of investment that you can invest in, but that one is not something you can see or you can feel. However, it still does happen. So that one definitely plays a good role itself. The third part of it, it's equity investment. Now, this is the one that personally, I don't know how to see this, because an equity investment could be anything from, investing in companies, right? Like sometimes you hear, oh, this company put in $20 million or $30 million into this small startup. That is part of the investment. That counts as part of the investment, because the way that pledge language is structured, if I say I'm going to invest, let's say, $1 million into the local economy, me buying a newspaper is part of that investment. If I buy a local newspaper, it's part of that investment, right? If I buy a local business, it's part of that investment. So that's the part where the venture stake and equity investment part gets a little murky because if I buy a newspaper business, for example, local newspaper, and it had 100 employees, I really have not added anything. I just bought the newspaper and I still maintain the same 100 employees. So I didn't create any new jobs. I didn't create anything new, but it's part of investment because I now own that newspaper. So it's considered technically the money I spent buying that factors in into the pledge or part of the pledge or the investment that I said I was going to do. There's another part also called loans, right? So loans, it could be loaning to small businesses. So maybe and sometimes, and I think this applies to this. Sometimes you see a bank, a local bank, for example, being here in Charlotte, you will see sometimes these banks like Wells Fargo or Bank of America will have programs where they're giving small businesses up to $100,000, right, of loans to help grow their business. But you just got to meet certain parameters. Maybe you have to make at least $500,000 a year in revenue and whatever else to put in place. So those loans also play a role. It counts as a part of the pledge. It's part of the investment because giving these businesses loan is part of the investment. Now, I can lean more towards that because yes, it makes sense. Because you give these businesses loan, yeah, you're investing in them because sometimes without those loans, some of these businesses will go out of business. So that makes a lot of sense. There's also grants and philanthropy, right? So maybe during, I don't know, Thanksgiving, right? If one of these organizations decide, okay, we're going to feed the homeless in that city, that is part of investment. Maybe they spend $100,000 doing that. It could be philanthropy for, okay, we're gonna give $200,000 to this NGO that is helping underserved youths or whatever it is, whatever lingo they want to use to help them get better, up their math scores or reading scores or whatever that is. Those philanthropic givings or gifts, if you will, or donations, it's part of investment because you're investing in the community. So that's part of the pledge. Then, of course, you also have conditional incentive driven investments, right? Like, sometimes, you're giving out tax credits, you know, little other things that you can do from here. I mean, every now and then to get the whole thing up and going. Now, with that being said, I have my own issues. And also there are also other aspects of investments like this that I think is deceptive because a lot of times you see these companies when they make these pledges, some of these pledges never get to happen. Now, and I know I talked about political signaling in terms of, looking good in front of the cameras. The politician, whether it's the governors, the mayor, or the president, feels. I mean, I think they know this. They know this basically optics, right? They understand these optics. Now, to the average person who's going to have to live through that, may not quite understand all that. But the part that I don't like is a lot of times these pledges have conditions to it that you and I will never really get to understand. Now, we've experienced some of it. It's just that we don't quite understand how that came about. I'll give you an example. When Amazon, a few years ago, Amazon decided to open a second headquarters and it put out a bid and said, hey, we're looking to open a second headquarters. We want cities to come in and bid. Now, the average person might think, well, Amazon is trying to find the best place to build. That is necessarily not true. Amazon was basically trying to get cities to come in and say, okay, well, how much tax incentives are you going to give me? Yeah, they had this whole thing of we're going to bring in 50,000 new jobs. We're going to build a new headquarters. We're bringing more jobs. The economy, we're going to pump in X amount of money in the economy. But the part that is being left out is the fact that how much is a city going to give them in terms of incentives? Now, Virginia, I believe Virginia ended up getting the whole thing, right? And it basically beat out cities like New York and whatever else. It was basically a competition for incentives. Now that sounds good when you hear a company like Amazon is building new headquarters, but a lot of times those jobs or that company coming in there is going to be subsidized by tax incentives that that city or state will have to give that company. So those things will come up as pledges from the front end, but it's really not pledges. It's more like I'm going to bring my company in, but you're going to have to pay me in a sense or subsidize me coming into your city and bringing you these jobs, which, by the way, a lot of these jobs are going to be occupied by people moving from other states. It's not really going to be people from within that state because if Amazon, let's say, came to Charlotte, a bunch of their employees are going to, it's not like they're going to come in and say, okay, now we're hiring 50,000 new people. No, a lot of times those jobs are coming with the people already. So people are going to come from Washington and other parts of the country. So you're not really getting those 50,000 jobs. You're getting, I don't know, maybe 10,000 if you're lucky, because some of those high level jobs, like the higher executive roles, are going to come from people from outside. People are going to be, they're going to people coming from, maybe they're going to promote somebody from Washington, the main office, or somebody from another state, and they're just going to move into Charlotte and basically do the job. You're going to get hired, they're going to hire regular people to do the regular side of the job, like maybe warehouse or whatever that case might be. In some cases, might find some managers here, but you're not going to get those whole 50,000, jobs. And another part that's also very deceptive too, especially when you think of a company like Apple, for example. And I'm not trying to shit on them by any means. The whole point I'm trying to make is so people can understand what those pledges actually mean. Because as a business, I understand it. I'll probably do the same thing too. So I'm not sitting here trying to be one of those people that are like, criticizing corporate America. No, not at all. Because when you're doing a business, you do what you got to do, right? Because if you know the president can just sign one new law or take an executive order and your business is now suffering. Like you see what was going on with the tariffs. So I understand. I would do the same thing too. Now, when you see a company like Apple, who's also said they're going to do that much, that many billions of dollars. Now, a lot of people got confused thinking, well, okay, manufacturers going to come back to the US. We're going to basically, start making phones here, or the phones are going to be expensive, whatever. That's not the case. It's not happening because part of that pledge also has to do with supply chain and logistics. Because if Apple, let's say, I'm just going to throw this out there, let's say they invest 100 billion of that money into making sure that their supply chain of getting their phones, from one port to another, or the distribution of their phones in different locales or different states in the country, it's upgraded to, I don't know, let's just say they have driverless trucks now that can take their stuff from one place to another or whatever that is. That is part of the investment. Manufacturing is never coming back to the US. No. That money is just going to go towards something else. Maybe they need to do more R&D on their on new products that they're trying to build, right? Maybe Apple is trying to venture in the new space, or they want to make their iPhones better and they want to hire more engineers to work on their software or maybe their operating system or whatever that is. Those hirings and those things that's part of the investment. Case in point, lately there's been things in the news where Facebook, or Meta, if you will, where Mark Zuckerberg is hiring people for $1 billion, paying $1 billion for a talent to come and work at Meta. That is part of the investment. That counts towards that $600 billion that he talked about, because it's part of investment, hiring people. The $14 billion that he invested on Skill AI and got the co-founder to come run AI basically in Meta, that $14 billion goes into that $600 billion. So that is part of the investment when we talk about pledging to invest that much money. So I guess you can say that $14 billion already off that 600 billion, which, by the way, I don't think it's going to be 600. Another thing we also need to keep in mind is at some point, that money does not get spent because things change, laws change. Because, take for example, when he said he's going to invest that over 4 years, the current president, Trump, has what, 3.5 years to go. And this, as much as you can split that amount of, say, 600 by 4, yeah, no, it doesn't. you can't split that equally. They're not going to spend an equivalent amount of, the split every year. It just depends. Maybe one year they'll spend, maybe that $14 billion that he invested in scale AI is going to be the only investment we're going to see from a Meta this year. I'm just saying, as an example, that might be the only investment we're going to see, right? There could be more, but there's no guarantee that, okay, you have to split the money in 4 quarters, and every year you spend a quarter of that amount. No, that's not how it happens. And also, laws change because this president might be out, or this president might take an executive order, have an executive order to put something else in place, and it basically disrupts what was in motion. So they'll pull their money back and say, nah, we're good. Thank you. We can't invest that money now because the laws are not favorable to us. And guess what? These conversations are not going to be revisited. It's just going to die because the last time we had that meeting, you don't hear anybody talking about it anymore. All we just heard is these companies have pledged combined over $1 trillion in investment. But 4 years down the line, how do you know those investments actually happen? There's no way to find out because unless a company says we're going to build 5 warehouses or 5 manufacturing plants in the US, and you can physically see those manufacturing plants, it probably never happened. Because because if I'm a software company, like let's say a Meta or an Apple or some other, maybe Nvidia, whatever it is, if I'm buying these other startups, how is that creating more jobs people who for people in a new state or country or whatever that might be? Because if I'm buying a new startup, I'm probably going to lay off more people because that's what they do anyway. They buy a new company, they lay off more people from the company. Some people, they lay them off. Sometimes they buy a company just for the IP. So they take that IP and integrate it into their own company, and that's how they grow, and that becomes part of the investment. So the whole point is sometimes you don't know, you don't see those things happening. And like I said, I'm not blaming them. As a business person, I'll probably do the same thing. But I think the average person needs to understand what these investments mean. So all these pledges sound good. And trust me, I'm a fan of this administration. So anybody who knows me knows that. So I'm not trying to, shit on the administration or anything. I'm just saying that because to me, I was always been curious. I did this basically for me. I've always been curious, where does that money go? How does the pledge work? Then I realized it's a pledge, it's a good number to throw out there, but deep down, it doesn't mean that, okay, you're going to see how the money is going to be spent. And I was thinking myself that, okay, maybe Apple will bring manufacturing to the US, but that's not true. Maybe some of these companies that manufacture the stuff in China or no, Taiwan or India, whatever that is, they're going to bring it back. No, they're not. That is not part of it. The investment can go in so many different ways. Like I mentioned, you can buy a business, you can give out loans, you can do philanthropic donations, you can improve your supply chain, you can you can expand your R&D. All that is part of the pledge. So really, if you think about it, the average person is getting screwed. When you hear that, you get excited. But I'm sure the business people and the politicians understand what that means. Because once those meetings happen and all these pledges happen and the politician is happy, the donors are happy. I'm sure the donors know this too, because most of the donors are like successful business people. So they get it. I think more of the voters, when the voters are happy as well, say, okay, well, because of this administration or this president, we have over $1 trillion or over $2 trillion worth of investment that has been pledged to the country. It sounds good on paper, but a lot of times those things don't really come into play. It doesn't happen. Now, for someone who cares so much about wanting to know where does money go, the only way you can find out is if you are like a finance nerd, you care so much about this stuff, then go look at their, the 10K filings or whatever, the FCC filing, and you find those things and look at, where they put their money in terms of like, you know, like special purpose ventures or joint ventures or, infrastructure. Go look at those things, right? If you care so much But I don't think the average person is going to do that. The average person is just going to wait and see what actually physically happens. But you may not see it, and you may see it too. So let's not get it. Let's not. I'm not trying to say that nothing happens, but you may see it and you may not see anything. But the point is, just so you understand that these pledges sound good on paper, but in reality, do they really come into play? Because a lot of it, I would say, based on what I found, sometimes up to 70% of those pledges don't even happen. Because a lot of times they don't intend to do anything. They just do that for political purposes, to not be on the wrong side of somebody who has the ability to affect your business in terms of like maybe taking an executive order in this situation. Because one thing about the companies will always outlive presidents. Like Apple was founded in what, 1976, I believe, 75, 76. Do you know how many presidents they've been through? All they have to do is just comply a little bit and wait out that president. The next person comes in, maybe might not be as tough as the previous one. Or if they're equally as tough or tougher, they can just play along and wait that person out. That's just how it's going to be. There are companies that have been around for 100 years, right? They've seen so many presidents. So the game is just to play the game so you cannot be left out. And once that president steps aside, now you can keep doing what you do until somebody else comes in and becomes a pain in your butt. So that's just how the game is played. And I hope that helps you a little bit understand how these pledges work. Now, if you really did find this really interesting and insightful for you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, leave a comment if you will. Thank you.